My son said it was for financial security when he gave me the papers to sign, but it was a lie that cost me my home. They say the worst betrayals come from the people you trust with your life. I never believed that until I discovered what my own son had been doing behind my back for months. The person I'd raised, taught right from wrong, the one I thought would always have my back. He destroyed everything I had while smiling at me and calling it family love. I'm 61 years old, and I thought I'd seen every kind of backstabbing there was during my years in the service and decades working as an electrician. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the day I realized that my biggest enemy wasn't some stranger or business rival. It was the kid I'd been protecting my whole life. You know how some mornings feel like they'll be just like every other morning for the rest of your life? That's exactly how I felt, living in my little house in Anaheim, California. My mornings always started the same way. The creak of that old bed that Ellen and I bought back in '82, the smell of dollar store coffee brewing in my ancient machine, some talk show mumbling on the radio, and of course, that neighbor firing up his lawnmower at exactly 7 a.m. like he got some personal vendetta against sleep. I'm Harry Burke, by the way, retired electrician, widowed veteran who thinks he can fix everything, including broken hearts, which is probably the biggest joke of all. I spent 30 years rewiring houses, 20 years married to the most patient woman who ever lived, and the last 3 years learning that grief doesn't follow any electrical diagram I've ever seen. My house in Anaheim wasn't much to look at. Small, cramped, with cracks running down the kitchen wall that looked like a roadmap to nowhere. But those cracks were part of my story, mine and Ellen's. The smell of orange trees drifting through the windows on warm afternoons. The constant hum of lawnmowers from neighbors who apparently had nothing better to do than achieve the perfect grass height. This was home. I knew every creak in that house, every loose floorboard, every spot where the paint was peeling. The living room still had the old radio where Ellen and I used to dance on Saturday nights back in the 70s, when we thought we had all the time in the world. Now it just played the same old songs that made me remember how her laugh sounded. Then there's my son Tim, 41 years old, still chasing dreams like he's 25. As a kid, he'd build these elaborate Lego castles, his little face serious as Walt Disney himself, promising me he was going to make his old man a millionaire someday. Back then, it sounded as sweet as those old radio tunes I loved fixing. Now it sounds like the cruelest joke life ever played on me. Tim had this way of talking that made everything sound reasonable. He'd show up at my door with coffee from Starbucks, not the dollar stuff I was used to, wearing his fancy business clothes, explaining complicated things about taxes and financial planning. He kept talking about how I needed to think about the future, about protecting my assets, about something called estate planning. I'd sit there on my cracked leather couch, holding Ellen's photograph while Tim laid out papers across my kitchen table. Ellen always told me never to lose faith in Tim, and her words used to be like music from that old radio we danced to. But lately, something inside me felt disconnected, like a wire that got crossed somewhere along the way. Tim made it sound so simple. Transfer the house deed to his name for tax benefits and better control of the property. He had charts, documents, explanations about how this would save money in the long run. He talked about taking care of me, about making sure I'd never have to worry about anything. The paperwork looked official enough, and he was my son, the kid who used to promise me millions while building castles out of plastic blocks. But Tim always was a risk-taker. Even as a kid, he'd climb trees that were too tall, ride his bike down hills that were too steep, start projects that were too big for him to finish. Ellen used to say it was good that he dreamed big, but I always worried about what would happen when those dreams crashed into reality. I signed those papers on a Tuesday afternoon while the neighbor was, predictably, mowing his lawn. The pen felt heavy in my hand, and I kept looking at Ellen's picture on the mantel, wondering if she'd approve. Trust, I told myself, was like an electrical circuit. You had to have faith that all the connections would hold. For about a year, nothing changed. Tim would visit every few weeks, always talking about his latest business venture, some startup that was going to revolutionize something or other. He'd mention investors, partnerships, opportunities that were too good to pass up. I'd nod and make coffee and try to understand what he was talking about. But business was never my strong suit. I was good with wires and circuits, not with whatever complicated schemes Tim was always cooking up. Then came the day that changed everything. I was sitting in my kitchen, reading the newspaper and listening to morning talk shows, when I heard the mail truck pull up. Nothing unusual there, bills, advertisements, the occasional card from Ellen's sister in Phoenix. But this time, there was an envelope that made my coffee go cold in my mouth. Notice of foreclosure. It said in big, official letters. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake, maybe meant for someone else, or one of those scam letters that look official but aren't. I almost laughed, but then I saw the bank's name, saw my address, saw my name spelled out in black and white, and the laughter got stuck somewhere in my throat. The documents inside were full of legal language I didn't understand, but the meaning was crystal clear. My house. The house where Ellen and I had built our life together, where we'd raised Tim, where every crack in the wall told a story, had been used as collateral for a loan I never knew existed. That's when I found the letter in my mailbox, the one that really broke me. It was from Tim, written on fancy letterhead from some company I'd never heard of. The handwriting was rushed, like he'd written it in a hurry, maybe at 3 a.m. when guilt finally caught up with him. The letter explained everything. How he'd taken out a loan against the house to fund his latest startup, how the business had failed, how the investors had pulled out, how everything had gone wrong faster than he'd expected. He wrote about how I'd taught him to take risks, how I'd always said you had to bet on yourself if you want to succeed in America. But here's the part that really got me. At the end of the letter, he wrote that he was sorry, that he'd tried to make it work, that he'd hoped to pay everything back before I ever found out. He was living in a new place across town now with his wife and daughter. He said, starting over, trying to rebuild. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that their new apartment was already cramped with 3 people, no extra room for anyone else, no room for his old man, no invitation to figure things out together, just a casual mention that he'd moved on while I was about to lose everything. My electrical circuit of trust didn't just malfunction. It completely burned out, leaving me sitting in the dark. I thought the worst thing about living in Anaheim was that neighbor with his 7 a.m. lawnmower routine. Turns out, the worst thing is when your own son destroys your life and forgets to mention you're not invited to his fresh start. The foreclosure notice gave me 30 days. 30 days to pack up a lifetime, to say goodbye to the place where Ellen had lived and died, to figure out what comes next when you're 61 and suddenly homeless. I walked through that house, touching the walls, remembering conversations, trying to memorize the way the afternoon light came through the kitchen window. I had saved up some money over the years. Not much, but enough to buy a used travel trailer from a guy who was tired of the RV lifestyle. It wasn't fancy, barely big enough for one person, but it was something. The man who sold it to me kept apologizing for the condition it was in, but I told him it was perfect. After all, I was good with electrical work. I could fix whatever needed fixing. As I was packing up Ellen's things one more time, I went through the bedroom closet behind boxes of Christmas decorations that hadn't been touched since she passed. In the back, I found something I'd almost forgotten about, several yellowed tubes, the kind architects use for blueprints. These were my father's old drawings, stuff from back when he worked construction in the 60s. I'd been meaning to throw them away for years, but somehow I never got around to it. Now I was glad I'd kept them. The new owners would probably just toss everything in a dumpster, but these drawings were part of my family history. My dad had worked on some interesting projects back in the day, and even though I'd never really looked at them closely, they seemed worth preserving. On moving day, I stood in front of my house one last time, keys to the travel trailer in one hand, Ellen's wedding photo in the other. The orange trees were blooming, filling the air with that sweet smell that had been part of my mornings for decades. The neighbor's lawnmower was silent for once. Even he seemed to understand this wasn't a day for routine maintenance. I whispered Ellen's picture, telling her it looked like I was going alone from here on out. Then I climbed into the driver's seat of my old truck, the trailer hitched behind me, and started the engine. The smell of gasoline mixed with the scent of regret, and in my rear-view mirror, I watched my house get smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. Trust really is like an electrical circuit. One wrong wire, and everything goes dark. My wire just burned out, and I was heading toward the only place I could afford, a trailer park on the outskirts of town, where the rent was cheap and the neighbors minded their own business. As I drove away from everything I'd known for 30 years, I couldn't help thinking about Tim's letter, especially that last line that kept echoing in my head. "I'll pay you back everything, Dad." Whether he meant the money or something more, I didn't know. But as I pulled into the trailer park and saw my new home waiting for me, I realized that some debts can't be paid back with cash. The trailer park manager was a friendly enough guy who didn't ask too many questions about why a 61-year-old man was starting over in a 15-foot travel trailer. He just handed me the keys to my space, pointed out where the communal restrooms were, and wished me luck. I parked the trailer, turned off the engine, and sat there for a minute, trying to figure out what the next chapter of my life was supposed to look like. So there I was, sitting in what the trailer park manager cheerfully called my new home, a 15-foot aluminum box that looked like it had seen better decades. My new palace sat in the shadow of a giant that went by the name of Disneyland, close enough that I could hear the screams from the roller coasters mixing with the hum of my ancient air conditioning unit that sounded like it was dying a slow, painful death. The first thing you notice about living this close to the happiest place on earth is that happiness runs on a schedule. Every single night at exactly 9 p.m., like clockwork, their fireworks show would start. Boom, boom, boom. Explosions of light that lit up my thin trailer walls like some kind of psychedelic light show I never asked for. Each burst felt like a needle poking at my old heart because those fireworks kept dragging me back to 1959, when I was just a kid, and my dad Bob would take me to watch them build the Matterhorn. I remember the smell of fresh paint mixing with sawdust, the sound of workers laughing as they constructed what would become one of the most famous fake mountains in America. Back then, those sounds meant adventure and possibility. Now they were just noise keeping me awake. My dad was an engineer at Disneyland during the early days, one of those guys who helped turn Walt's crazy dreams into actual attractions that wouldn't kill people. He'd come home with stories about the magic they were creating, about how they were building something that would make families happy for generations. He used to say that working for Disney wasn't just a job. It was like being part of American history. Now here I was, a trailer park resident listening to the same fireworks that had once filled me with wonder, and all I could think about was how far I'd fallen from those days when everything seemed possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was living the shadow of dreams while my own life had turned into a nightmare. Living in a trailer park is like camping. Except instead of stars overhead, you've got neon signs. And instead of peaceful nature sounds, you've got your neighbor doing karaoke at 2 a.m. The guy 3 spots down apparently thought he was the next Frank Sinatra, and he practiced his craft with the dedication of someone who'd never heard himself sing. But I had bigger problems than amateur entertainers. I was going through boxes of stuff I'd managed to save from the house, trying to figure out what was worth keeping and what was just taking up space in my already cramped quarters. Most of it was junk. Old bills, broken tools, random kitchen gadgets that Ellen had insisted we needed but never used. Then I found my dad's things. Boxes that smelled like dust and old paper, filled with his personal effects from his Disney days. There were old company newsletters, faded photographs of construction sites, some tools he'd used for precision work. Nothing particularly valuable. Just the kind of stuff that means something to family, but worthless to everyone else. At the very bottom of one box, my hand hit something cylindrical. I pulled out an old architect's tube, the kind they use for storing blueprints and technical drawings. The cardboard was yellowed with age, held together with tape that had gone brittle over the decades. I'd seen these tubes in Dad's workshop when I was a kid, but never paid much attention to them. Inside was a single sheet of paper, carefully rolled and preserved. When I unrolled it on my tiny trailer table, I felt like time had stopped. It was a technical drawing, incredibly detailed, showing what looked like the internal structure of some kind of ride or attraction. The lines were precise, professional, the kind of engineering drawing that takes real skill to create. In the corner, written in marker that faded but was still readable, were the words that made my hand shake. Don't forget the child's first scream, WD. Those initials could only mean one thing. Walt Disney himself had written on this document. The drawing showed what looked like the internal mechanics of the Matterhorn bobsleds, But this wasn't any blueprint I'd ever seen in books or documentaries. Suddenly, those fireworks outside didn't sound like noise anymore. They sounded like echoes from the past, calling me back to a time when my dad would sit at our kitchen table, sketching and planning, working on projects that he said would bring joy to millions of people. I remembered watching him work late into the night, his face lit by the desk lamp, completely absorbed in his craft. I was sitting there staring at this drawing when I heard a knock on my trailer door. Now, in a trailer park, unexpected visitors usually mean one of three things. Someone's looking for trouble, someone's lost, or someone's selling something you don't want. I wasn't expecting any of those options. What I got instead was Marge, a 65-year-old widow from the trailer 2 spots over. She had appeared at my door like some kind of fairy godmother, holding a cup of something that smelled strong enough to strip paint, and wearing a smile that suggested she knew more about life than she was letting on. Marge had this theory that fireworks were the only thing keeping her young. She'd lived in the trailer park for 8 years, she told me, ever since her husband passed and left her with more medical bills than money. But every night, she'd sit outside her trailer and watch those Disney fireworks like they were personal entertainment put on just for her. She noticed I was looking a little lost and decided to investigate. That's how she ended up seeing the drawing spread out on my table. Her eyes went wide when she saw it, and she started asking questions I couldn't answer. Where did it come from? Was it real? Did I know what it was worth? When I explained that it was my dad's, that he'd worked at Disney in the early days, she got this look in her eyes like she just solved a puzzle. She told me about these online forums where Disney enthusiasts gather to discuss everything from ride mechanics to historical artifacts. People on these forums, she said, knew more about Disney history than most of the people who actually worked there. The internet has an answer for everything, Marge insisted, even the meaning of life. She suggested I take a photo of the drawing and post it online, see if anyone could tell me what I was looking at. It sounded crazy to me. I'd never been much for computers or social media, but what did I have to lose? I struggled with my old tablet, the one Ellen had bought me for Christmas a few years back that I'd barely learned to use. Taking a decent photo was harder than rewiring a house, but eventually I managed to get a clear shot of the drawing. The details were sharp enough that you could read the technical specifications and see every line of Walt's handwritten note. Posting it online felt like throwing a message in a bottle into the ocean. I wrote a simple caption. Anyone know what this is? Found in my dad's old Disney papers. Then I hit submit and waited, not really expecting much response from strangers on the internet. What happened next changed everything. Within an hour, my tablet was buzzing with notifications. Comments started pouring in from people who seemed to know a lot about Disney history. Some thought it was a reproduction. Others weren't sure. But a few people were asking very specific questions about the paper, the ink, the handwriting. Then I got a private message that made my heart skip a beat. It was from someone claiming to be a former Disney engineer, someone who'd worked on ride maintenance for decades. The message was short but urgent. This might be part of Walt's lost archive that was thought to be a myth. Call me immediately. Sometimes the past isn't what you remember. It's what you discover when you're not looking for it. I'd been sitting on what might be a piece of Disney history for years without knowing it, stored in a box with old tools and faded photographs, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I stared at that private message for a long time, reading it over and over again. Outside my trailer, the 9 o'clock fireworks started up right on schedule, painting my aluminum walls with flashes of red, blue, and gold. But for the first time since I'd moved into this place, those explosions didn't sound like reminders of what I'd lost. They sounded like possibilities I hadn't considered, like doors opening in directions I hadn't thought to look. My dad had always said that working at Disney meant being part of something bigger than yourself, something that would outlast your own lifetime. Maybe it left me more than just old papers and faded memories. I picked up my phone with shaking hands, looking at the number the former Disney engineer had sent me. The drawing was spread out on my table, Walt's handwritten note visible in the corner, and through my thin walls I could hear the grand finale of the fireworks show building to its crescendo. Sitting there in my trailer, holding my phone and staring at a drawing that might be worth more than everything I'd lost, I whispered to the empty air around me, "Dad, What exactly did you leave me? The fireworks exploded overhead one final time, and for a moment, the whole world was lit up like magic was still possible. That phone call changed everything. The former Disney engineer, a guy named Frank who sounded like he'd spent 40 years breathing sawdust and motor oil, told me to get that drawing to the Disney archives as fast as possible. He said if what he suspected was true, I might be holding a piece of history that everyone thought had been lost forever. 3 days later, I found myself standing outside the Walt Disney Studios in Burbank, feeling like a tourist who'd somehow wandered into the wrong movie. The security guard looked at me like I was another crazy person claiming to have found Mickey Mouse's birth certificate, but Frank had already called ahead. After checking my ID twice and making me sign more papers than when I bought my house, they finally let me through the gates. The Disney Archives office was tucked away in a building that looked ordinary from the outside, but felt like stepping into some kind of magical library once you got inside. The air smelled like old paper and possibility, mixed with that clean corporate smell that successful companies always seem to have. Even the hallways had display cases filled with original animation cells and props from movies I'd watched with Ellen years ago. Alice was the archivist who met me at the front desk, wearing Mickey Mouse-shaped glasses that should have looked ridiculous but somehow worked perfectly on her. She was probably in her 50s, with the kind of enthusiasm about Disney history that you usually only see in little kids meeting their favorite cartoon character. The first thing she said when she saw me was that Walt left behind more mysteries than treasures, and most of them would probably never be solved. She handled my dad's drawing like it was made of gold leaf and butterfly wings. Alice had this magnifying setup that looked like something from a crime lab, complete with special lights that could show details invisible to the naked eye. She examined every inch of that paper, checking the watermarks, analyzing the ink, even measuring the exact dimensions of Walt's handwritten note. After about an hour of tests that I didn't understand, Alice looked up at me with eyes that were practically glowing. What I had, she explained, was potentially an original Walt Disney prototype drawing for the Matterhorn bobsleds, possibly one that had been assumed lost in a fire back in 1984. But they'd need to run more comprehensive tests to be absolutely certain. Alice asked if I could leave the drawing with them for a few days while they conducted a full authentication process. They had equipment that could analyze everything from the paper composition to the exact chemical makeup of the ink. If it turned out to be genuine, she said with barely contained excitement, it would be one of the most significant Disney historical discoveries in decades. I left that archive office feeling like I was walking on air, but also terrified that I just handed over the most valuable thing I'd ever owned to complete strangers. The next 3 days crawled by slower than a California traffic jam. I kept checking my phone every 5 minutes, wondering if Alice would call with good news or the crushing disappointment that it was all just an elaborate fake. On Thursday morning, my phone finally rang. Alice's voice was so excited she could barely get the words out. The drawing was authentic, completely, undeniably real. The watermarks matched Disney's official paper from that era. The ink composition was consistent with what Walt used, and most importantly, the handwriting analysis confirmed it was definitely his. That note about the child's first scream wasn't just a random comment. It was Walt's philosophy about creating the perfect balance of excitement and fear in his attractions. He believed that the best rides made you feel completely safe while simultaneously scaring you just enough to make your heart race. It was psychological engineering at its finest, designed to create memories that would last a lifetime. Then Alice dropped the bombshell that nearly knocked me off my feet, even though I was sitting in my trailer at the time. Disney wanted to buy the drawing. Not just buy it. They wanted to make it the centerpiece of a new exhibit about Walt's design process. The offer was $6.2 million, plus lifetime VIP access to all Disney properties worldwide. Plus, they created a memorial display crediting my father's contribution to Disney history. $6,200,000. I sat there in my 15-foot trailer trying to process that number while Alice waited patiently for my response. $6 million was more money than I had made in my entire lifetime as an electrician. I could buy that whole trailer park. Hell, I could buy 10 trailer parks and still have enough left over to live like a king for the rest of my days. I didn't hesitate for a second. After losing everything to my son's betrayal and now living in a space smaller than most people's closets, The idea of financial security felt like winning the lottery. I told Alice I'd take the deal, all of it. The money, the VIP access, the memorial display for my dad. This was my shot at never having to worry about money again, and I wasn't about to mess it up. Alice sounded relieved that I'd accepted their offer without trying to negotiate for more. She scheduled another meeting for the following week to handle all the paperwork and legal documents. Before we hung up, she mentioned that she found something else in the archives that she thought I'd want to see, something connected to my father that had been discovered just days before I brought in the drawing. When I showed up for the contract signing, Alice had something in her hand that made my heart stop. It was a small, yellowed postcard from 1960, addressed to my father. The return address just said, W.D., Walt Disney himself. The message was short but powerful. Bob, keep this safe. Someday these designs will come alive again. On the back of the postcard was a simple sketch, just a few lines, but unmistakably Walt style. It showed a child's face, eyes wide with wonder and excitement, mouth open in what could have been a scream of joy or terror. Below the sketch, in Walt's handwriting, were the words, "This is why we build dreams." Alice explained that this postcard had been found in the company archives just a week before, filed away in a box of routine correspondence that no one had looked at for decades. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. It was like Walt himself was reaching across 60 years to confirm that my father had been more than just another employee. My dad and Walt Disney had worked together, collaborated on projects that shaped American culture, created experiences that brought joy to millions of families. And I'd never known any of it. Dad had come home every day, fixed dinner, helped me with homework, mowed the lawn on weekends, just like any other father. He'd never mentioned that he was part of building something that would outlast all of us. Alice told me the postcard was mine to keep, a gift from Disney to go along with the purchase of the drawing. She said they had plenty of Walt's correspondence in their archives, but this one was personal, a message from one dreamer to another, passed down through generations. It belonged with the family, not locked away in some corporate vault. The contract signing took 2 hours, and my hands were shaking the entire time. Not from nerves about the legal documents, but from the sheer unreality of becoming a millionaire by accident. I kept thinking about how Ellen would have reacted to all this. She probably would have wanted to give half of it away to charity, but she also would have been proud that her husband had stumbled into something this extraordinary. Walking out of that archive building with a check for $6.2 million in my pocket, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. The California sun was bright overhead, warm on my face in a way that reminded me of all those mornings in Anaheim when life had seemed predictable and secure. But this was different. This was the warmth of financial freedom, of knowing that I'd never have to worry about money again. I stood outside the Disney studios for a minute before getting back in my truck, looking up at the sky like I was trying to spot my dad somewhere up there in the blue. The postcard was in my shirt pocket, pressed close to my heart. And for the first time since Ellen died, I felt like the universe might actually be looking out for me. I whispered to the air around me, knowing it probably sounded crazy, but not caring who might hear. Dad, you're smiling up there, aren't you? The wind picked up just then, rustling the palm trees that lined the studio lot, and I swear it sounded almost like laughter, the kind of laugh my dad used to make when he was proud of something I'd accomplished. Driving back toward my trailer park with $6 million to my name, I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter that my father probably never could have imagined. He'd helped build dreams in the 1960s, and now, 60 years later, his work had just made his son rich beyond his wildest imagination. Having $6 million in your bank account changes everything, but not always in the ways you'd expect. The first thing I did was get the hell out of that trailer park. Don't get me wrong. Marge was great company, and those Disney fireworks had grown on me. But a man needs more than 15 feet of aluminum siding to call home. I found myself a house in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from Anaheim. Nothing too fancy, just a solid 1960s ranch-style place with a big backyard and neighbors who didn't feel the need to mow their lawns at dawn. The realtor kept calling it retro, but honestly, I wasn't trying to be trendy. I was just stuck in the 60s, the decade when my dad was building dreams at Disney, and everything in America felt possible. The house had everything I had missed during my brief trailer park adventure. A real kitchen where I could actually turn around without bumping into something. A living room big enough for Ellen's old furniture that I'd managed to buy back from the estate sale. And most importantly, a front porch where I could sit and watch the world go by without hearing someone's karaoke practice at 2 a.m. But something was missing, and it took me a while to figure out what it was. The new neighborhood smelled like fresh paint and lawn fertilizer, perfectly manicured and sterile. I missed the orange groves of Anaheim, that sweet citrus smell that had been part of my mornings for 30 years. Money could buy me a bigger house, but it couldn't buy back the scent of home. Marge showed up at my new place about a week after I moved in, carrying a thermos of something that could probably strip rust off a car bumper and shaking her head at my fancy new digs. She took one look at my expensive coffee maker and started laughing, pointing out that I was now a millionaire who still drank tea that cost 99 cents a box. That's when she brought up something I hadn't even thought about. With all that Disney money sitting in my account, I could do whatever I wanted, travel, buy cars, live like a king. But what was I actually going to do with it? Marge had this theory that money was like electricity. It was only useful if it was flowing somewhere, creating something, making things happen. That conversation got me thinking about my dad and what he would have wanted. He'd spent his career building things that brought joy to families, creating experiences that kids would remember for the rest of their lives. Maybe there was a way to honor that legacy while also doing something meaningful with this unexpected windfall. I decided to set up a scholarship fund, the Bob Burke Engineering Scholarship. Nothing too complicated, just enough money to help 5 kids every year go to college and study engineering, with a hope that maybe one of them would grow up to build the next great thing that would make families smile together. The paperwork was a nightmare, but it felt right. Within a few months, I started getting letters from the scholarship recipients. These weren't your typical thank you notes. These kids wrote about their dreams of creating theme park attractions, designing safer playgrounds, building bridges that would connect communities. Reading those letters was better than any interest payment I could have earned on that money. One girl from Phoenix wrote about wanting to design roller coasters that would be accessible to kids in wheelchairs. A boy from Detroit wanted to create interactive exhibits for science museums. Every letter reminded me that my dad's work was still inspiring new generations of dreamers, even 60 years later. Life was settling into a comfortable routine when my phone rang on a Tuesday morning in March. I almost didn't answer. After living as a millionaire for a few months, you learn that a lot of people suddenly want to be your friend. But something made me pick up, and there was Tim's voice on the other end, sounding nervous and uncertain. He'd heard through the grapevine that I was living in a nice house again, that somehow I'd landed on my feet after losing everything. He wanted to know how I'd managed it, where the money had come from, whether I'd won some kind of settlement from the foreclosure. The questions came rapid fire, like he was conducting an investigation rather than calling his father. I told him the truth, that I'd inherited something valuable from his grandfather, something I'd held on to all these years without knowing what it was worth. I explained about the Disney drawing, about the archives, about the money that had literally fallen out of the sky and changed everything. I could hear the disbelief in his voice, like he thought I was making up some elaborate story. Tim said he wanted to come see me, to see this house, to understand how his old man had somehow become wealthy overnight. There was something in his tone that set off alarm bells, not curiosity, but calculation. The same tone he'd used when he was convincing me to sign over my house deed for those supposed tax benefits. I gave him my address, but I also gave him fair warning. I told him that if he was thinking about asking me for money, he could save himself the gas money and stay home. I'd learned my lesson about trusting family with financial matters, and I wasn't interested in being anyone's personal ATM, even my own son's. When Tim showed up at my door the following Saturday, he looked older than I remembered. The stress of whatever business failures he'd been dealing with had added lines around his eyes and gray to his hair. He stood at my front gate holding a store-bought pie and a rolled-up piece of paper, like he was a door-to-door salesman trying to make his quota. He handed me the paper first. It was a drawing made by my granddaughter Emma, his 8-year-old daughter I barely knew. Tim's wife had never been fond of me. Something about me being too set in my ways or not understanding their modern parenting style. After a few tense family dinners years ago, she'd basically stopped bringing Emma around. I'd sent birthday cards and Christmas presents, but seeing my granddaughter maybe twice a year had left us strangers to each other, which broke my heart more than I'd ever admitted. The picture showed a stick figure version of me standing next to what was clearly supposed to be the Matterhorn, with crayon fireworks exploding overhead. At the bottom, in careful second-grade handwriting, it said, "My grandpa the hero." That little girl had somehow drawn a connection I'd never expected, bridging the gap her parents had created between us. That drawing hit me harder than any apology Tim could have offered. Here was this child who hardly knew me, creating art that connected me to the Disney legacy that had changed my life. She'd somehow understood something about her family history that the adults had forgotten, that we were part of something bigger than our individual mistakes and disappointments. Tim started talking about how sorry he was, how he'd never meant for things to go so wrong, how he'd been trying to create something that would make the whole family proud. The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced his speech during the drive over. But when he mentioned Emma, when he talked about wanting her to have a grandfather she could be proud of, his voice cracked just enough to sound genuine. I looked at this man, my son, who destroyed my trust and stolen my security, and realized that forgiveness wasn't going to be some Hollywood moment where we hugged and everything went back to normal. Real forgiveness was going to be work, the kind of daily construction project that takes months or years to complete. I told Tim that he'd sold my house, but he hadn't sold my ability to trust. That was something he had to earn back, one conversation at a time. I invited him to sit on the porch and eat that store-bought pie. But I also made it clear that our relationship was starting over from scratch, like we were strangers who happened to share some DNA. Tim thought bringing pie would fix everything between us. I told him he could start by bringing a broom. There was plenty of work to do if he wanted to rebuild what he'd torn down. It wasn't a joke, either. I had gutters that needed cleaning, a fence that needed painting, and a whole list of projects that could give us something to do with our hands while we figured out how to talk to each other again. Forgiveness isn't a door you open. It's a bridge you build, one plank at a time. I wasn't sure we'd ever finish construction on ours. But that afternoon, watching Tim awkwardly attempt to clean my gutters while telling me about Emma's soccer games and school projects, felt like we'd at least started measuring the distance we needed to span. 6 months passed, and I settled into a routine that felt like the life I'd always wanted but never known how to create. I'd wake up early and go for walks around the neighborhood, listening to classic rock on my headphones and nodding to neighbors who were just starting to figure out I wasn't some eccentric old guy, but an actual millionaire who chose to live quietly. Tim kept showing up every few weeks, always with some home improvement project, as an excuse to spend time together. He never asked for money directly, but I could see the question lurking behind every conversation about his business struggles, his mortgage payments, Emma's private school tuition. Each time he started heading in that direction, I'd change the subject or find something else for him to fix. Finally, one afternoon while he was replacing a section of my fence, Tim worked up the courage to ask outright. He needed help with a business loan, he said, just enough to get his latest venture off the ground. He'd learned from his mistakes, he claimed, and this time would be different. He promised he'd pay me back with interest, that this was his chance to finally make something work. I set down my iced tea and looked at my son, really looked at him. Here was a 42-year-old man still chasing the same dreams that had gotten him into trouble before, still convinced that the next big idea would solve all his problems. I realized that giving him money wouldn't help either of us. It would just enable him to keep making the same mistakes while destroying what little trust we'd managed to rebuild. I told Tim that I didn't want to hear another word about money, loans, investments, or business opportunities. If he brought up finances again, if he tried to turn our relationship into a banking arrangement, then we wouldn't have a relationship at all. I'd rather have no son than have one who only called when he needed something from my wallet. The conversation got heated after that. Tim accused me of being selfish, of sitting on millions while my own family struggled. I reminded him that he'd made his choices when he stole my house, and now he had to live with the consequences. We ended up yelling at each other across my backyard, neighbors probably watching the drama unfold from their kitchen windows. Tim left that day without finishing the fence, and I didn't hear from him for 2 months. Part of me wondered if I'd been too harsh, if I should have just given him the money and saved us both the fight. But a bigger part of me knew that some bridges can't be built with cash. They require something more valuable, something that can't be bought or borrowed. Then one evening in late spring, Tim showed up at my door with Emma in tow. She was wearing a Disney princess dress and carrying a small backpack decorated with Mickey Mouse ears. Tim explained that they were going to Disneyland the next day, and Emma had asked if Grandpa could come along. Apparently, she'd been thinking about that drawing she'd made, about her grandfather the hero, who was somehow connected to the magical mountain she'd seen in pictures. I hadn't been to Disneyland since I was a kid, back when my dad would take me to see the construction progress. The thought of walking through those gates as an adult, as someone whose family had actually contributed to the park's history, felt both exciting and terrifying. But looking at Emma's eager face, I knew I couldn't say no. The next morning, we drove to Anaheim together, 3 generations of Burkes heading toward the place where my father had helped build dreams. Emma chattered the entire way about all the rides she wanted to go on, all the characters she hoped to meet. Tim was quiet, probably still processing our money conversation from months earlier. Walking into Disneyland felt like stepping into a living memory. The sounds, the smells, the energy of families creating memories together. It was exactly what my dad had described all those years ago. But now there was something extra, something that made every step feel significant. Somewhere in this park was a memorial to my father's work, a permanent reminder that Bob Burke had helped create magic. We found the new Matterhorn exhibit tucked away near the ride entrance. There, behind glass, was a reproduction of my dad's drawing alongside information about the early Disney engineers who'd turned Walt's dreams into reality. A small plaque credited Bob Burke as one of the original designers, and next to it was a photograph I'd never seen before, my dad in his work clothes, standing next to Walt Disney himself, both of them smiling at the camera. Emma read the plaque slowly, her finger tracing each word. When she finished, she looked up at me with those wide 8-year-old eyes and asked if my daddy had really helped build a mountain. I nodded, feeling my throat get tight with emotions I hadn't expected. In her eyes, I could see the same wonder I'd felt as a kid, watching my father work on projects that seemed impossible. We spent the rest of the day exploring the park, riding attractions my dad had helped design, eating overpriced popcorn, and watching Emma's face light up with every new experience. Tim and I didn't talk about money or business or any of the things that had come between us. We just focused on being a family, on creating the kind of memories that would last long after the cotton candy was forgotten. As the sun was setting, we found ourselves back at the Matterhorn, watching the evening crowds gather for fireworks show. Emma had fallen asleep against my shoulder, exhausted from a full day of magic. Tim was looking at his father's memorial display, maybe finally understanding what legacy really meant. The fireworks started right on schedule, painting the sky with colors that reminded me of those nights in the trailer park when I had first discovered my dad's drawing. But now, instead of feeling like painful reminders of everything I'd lost, those explosions felt like celebration of family, of second chances, of the unexpected ways life can surprise you when you're not looking. Standing there with my son and granddaughter, watching fireworks explode over the park my father had helped build, I realized there was one more thing I needed to do. This little girl deserved more than just a grandfather who'd found his way back to financial stability. She deserved a future that no one could take away from her. The next week, I had my lawyer draw up documents establishing an education trust fund for Emma, $100,000 set aside specifically for her college education, completely separate from anything her parents could touch or mess up. When I handed Tim those papers, I explained that this wasn't charity or some attempt to buy back his trust. This was about making sure my granddaughter had opportunities, regardless of whatever financial mistakes her father might make in the future. The money was hers, locked away until she turned 18, protected from anyone who might think they knew better ways to spend it. Tim stared at those documents for a long time, and I could see him fighting between gratitude and pride. Finally, he just nodded and said he'd make sure Emma knew where the gift came from, that she'd understand her grandfather believed in her future, even when the adults in her life were still figuring things out. I thought getting older meant being afraid of heights, afraid of taking risks, afraid of getting hurt again. Turns out, the thing I was really afraid of was forgiving, letting go of anger that had become comfortable, building bridges when walls felt safer. Sitting in my living room that evening, looking at the photo from the Disney Memorial and Walt's postcard that I now kept on my mantle, I whispered to the quiet air around me, "Dad, you're not finished yet." Because maybe the best drawings aren't the ones we complete. Maybe they're the ones we pass down, leaving room for the next generation to add their own lines to the design. Life is like a blueprint. You never know where the lines will lead, but the important thing is to keep drawing, to keep building, to keep believing that the next section might be the most beautiful part of the whole design. And sometimes, the most important investment you can make isn't in your own future, but in making sure the people you love have the tools they need to build their own dreams.